Hey folks, welcome to Role of Law. Today I want to talk about world building, which is something I really enjoy. You get to create an entire universe for your game to take place in, and you'll have full control over it. So if there's something you want in terms of exploring particular kinds of stories, you can shape the world for that purpose. And you're never going to be in a position where you are getting the lore wrong because you know it best. Now, some people prefer to run with a campaign setting that is off the shelf, and there are some advantages to that. One, it's a lot less work, and two, your players may already know the lore of that world without you needing to share that with them. So those are some advantages, but personally, I like to run my own campaign settings. It's just how I prefer to play the game. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about how I go about creating a campaign setting because it's also something that many people find daunting. So I'm going to be using the example of my Breaking Waves setting, which is the one I really prefer to play in. It's the one that I've put the most work into. And so the way I go about making a new world or making a new campaign setting, and really I apply this model to anything I'm looking to create, whether it's a town, whether it's a thieves guild or some other organization, anything. This is a model that I think works really well. And I sort of describe it as the big small model. Basically, start out by thinking of something that's a really big question. And then after you've sort of come to that one, switch gears and go and answer a really small question. And you can alternate back and forth between all of these. Now, I'm sort of walking people through some of my thought process when I was creating this world, but it doesn't really take place over the kind of time frame for a video. Usually when I'm thinking these things up, it's going to be over a time period, and a lot of my thinking is going to be while I'm doing other things. I've had some of my best ideas while I was driving in my car to go to wherever, that kind of thing. So I spend a fair bit of time daydreaming about these questions and just kind of letting them stew. But just to give some examples. So I might start off with a big question, which is just, what does my world look like? If you were to see it from space or whatever, what would the shape of it be? What would it, what's it physically look like? And kind of the default assumption here is going to be like a planet in a solar system and so forth. And that's really easy because everybody kind of understands that, but you don't have to go with that. Discworld is a flat disc on top of a turtle with 4 elephants. That's perfectly fine too. And so when I was thinking about this setting, I wanted to make it a deliberately magical setting. So I'm going to go closer to the Discworld aspect than I will to the sort of real world planets model. Basically, what I came up with is sort of a lens shape that is kind of floating through space, surrounded by a crystal, not really crystal, but a transparent sphere that essentially keeps all of space out. And I kind of decided that this is all a very, it's created by, by deities. But it's not going to be something where I'm going to, strictly speaking, be abiding by the laws of physics. And so you'll probably get a player at some point who goes, well, how does this even work? I mean, how do we have gravity if it's, if this and that? And this is the point where I just kind of do this. And this is kind of my answer, right? I'm not really running a world where everything is going to be governed by strict physics. Instead, I'm going to have a world with elves and magic and, all sorts of things. So I'm really intentionally leaning into that in order to kind of break some of those assumptions. Now, the next question I'm going to ask is a really small question. That's going to be, what kind of place do I want to start people in? Like, where do I want to sort of begin? And for that, my sort of daydreaming took me to the idea of a small town called King's Rest. And this is where I usually start campaigns in this setting because it's just kind of convenient. I sort of got the idea from this from an old game for Myth the Fallen Lords. The first level has you in, I can't remember if it's Otter Ferry or something else, but regardless, it's this little tiny town. And I'm going, that to me makes sense. So, and then I can stop and take some time and think about like what kind of town is King's Rest. I'm thinking a fairly small place. I'm thinking on a roadway. I actually came up with the notion of I wanted a smaller town first, and the name actually came about because I was kind of pondering this place and thinking about it as sort of one of these small towns that is just a place that you stop on the way to other places, similar to these gas station towns that you might find in the real world. And I thought King's Rest because this is a place where sort of historically a king stopped on the way to somewhere else, and this was such a big event they named the town after it, and they've been kind of resting on those laurels for hundreds of years. So it's a place that's got history, it's got long-rooted families and so forth, but it's still a small town, and it still doesn't have much going on. So that's kind of a little question, right? Getting right down into brass tacks. And then I can switch up and ask a big question. What makes my world different from other worlds? Because there's lots of different campaign settings out there. And you really, it's one thing to say, okay, well, my setting is going to be, this and that. But so many settings out there are basically Lord of the Rings with the serial numbers filed off. And if that's all you've got is, sort of a setting that's very similar to other settings, then what makes this one that your players want to play in or that somebody else might want to pick up? What makes this one different and unique? So my thinking on this one was I decided to play with the idea that the oceans themselves are hostile. And so really kind of leaning into in some ways, some Lovecraft influences in the sense of Lovecraft often has moments of, the deep ones and those kinds of things, but to a degree that is a little more extreme and that has some larger consequences. So in this case, shipping doesn't really happen as a thing. People aren't, there's no seafaring because it's just too dangerous to do so. And in fact, you don't get coastal cities, which then starts making us ask a bunch of other questions. How do people engage in trade if they're not doing that? Well, roadways, riverways, these kinds of things. But trade is also going to be more expensive and more difficult. And those are things that we're going to have to consider and play with. Salt. Salt has been a major factor in human development. And so, thinking about salt mining as a much more significant thing if you can't have sort of ocean salt. All of these are big kind of questions that we can play with, but that's sort of where I started on this one. All right, now going from that, I can go and address another little question. And so this is sort of narrowing in on very specific elements. And so I'm going back to King's Rest and going, well, I've decided to start my campaign there, but what's happening in King's Rest that makes this interesting? Now, King's Rest is, and you can see from the map here, it's kind of a border town, but it's on the Pergamon side of this border. And so I thought, well, I could have places at war, but war is itself, it's something that's already on the go. I thought it would be more interesting to have them at the brink of conflict, where there's, conflict that might happen, but hasn't happened yet. There's tensions that could lead to a war, but, this might be something that the players can try to intervene in and prevent. That, I think, is more interesting. And what about King's Rest itself specifically? Well, I had the thought of what if this town is now about to experience a sort of, a gold rush. Although I decided maybe not gold, but it could be if I wanted to tie it back into my larger thing. Maybe they're about to open a salt mine or a silver mine or any of these possibilities. So I'm thinking King's Rest is about to have some sort of economic boom. And then, this is in the middle of this tension and conflict. Now I've got some stuff that's going on in King's Rest, and it's still a little town. And part of that is that my goals aren't necessarily for the players to just stay in King's Rest forever. It's a town that they can grow out of and then move on to bigger towns and bigger things. But it's a good sort of starting point. And I think that sort of establishes uh, that, at least, for now. And I can go back and ask a big question, you know, so what are my major cosmic tensions? Like, what in the universe are the big fights? And I decided to align my sort of deities. Usually there's sort of a good evil kind of dichotomy, and I decided to focus more heavily on the law chaos dichotomy. And especially this kind of plays into my hostile oceans idea, because the oceans at that point seem to me to be kind of reflective of chaos. If you've been on the seas, you see the high waves, you see the churning, storms, all of that. That feels chaotic to me. And so a tension between that and sort of more orderly forces, which in some ways are symbolized by our land, but also by, lawful deities that want to establish more orderly ways of being. And so I thought that is a good sort of source of more cosmic tension. And then from there, I can go and start designing the actual gods that make up the pantheon and say, okay, let's, some of these are going to be more definitively chaotic, and let's kind of organize it in that fashion. Now, there is still, of course, going to be the sort of usual good-evil dichotomy, and especially because players typically gravitate in that direction. But it gives me an idea to play with in terms of how I organize those thoughts. And then I can zoom in again on my little town of King's Rest and say, okay, who are the people in King's Rest? What are the sort of places that a player might go? And so I can start designing things like, what is the inn that the players might stay at? Are there more than one? Well, it's a small town, so if there's gonna be more than one, it's probably not many. And I can decide who the mayor is. I can decide who the innkeeper is, the main sort of inn. I can decide, if these people like each other or do they not like each other? What's happening there? So this is a method that I find really useful, because what you end up with is fairly quickly doing this sort of alternating. You can end up with something that is usable a lot faster than you'd think it would be, and you can dive into the game. Now, there's going to be a whole lot of middle ground that it takes you a lot longer to get to, but that sort of middle level stuff tends to be the stuff that isn't as significant, at least in the short term. Players are really going to need to know some of the big questions about things like, what is the world like? What are the gods in this world? How do the gods relate to each other? Those sorts of things. And, what are the big fundamental assumptions of the world that are different from the real world or different from other settings that they may have played in? What are those kinds of things that they need to know when making a character? And similarly, you can jump, they're going to need to know these things where you jump in and get really narrow. What is the town we're looking at right now? And, other towns are a more mid-level problem. You can start to detail them right away. So even though at the start I may know, listen, I'm planning on getting the party over to this town right here, Monbarazal. That's where we're going to go. But I don't need to design a whole lot about that right now. When it becomes time that I'm going to be looking at that, I can apply this same big, small method to that town itself. You know, big questions. Who rules this town? Who runs it? Little questions. Uh, what's the neighborhood that the players are currently staying in like? And you can apply this to basically any level of abstraction you want to use on your world. But for whatever sort of structure that you're trying to create, whether it's at the world level or at the town level or anything else, that method I find tends to get you, it tends to help facilitate a good design and one that is coherent and fun to use, but also helps tend to get you to something usable faster than you might expect. Anyway, that's just some basic thoughts here. If people are curious about the campaign setting that I like to play in, I will, I can do more details on that. But I just thought I'd really share that method with you because it's one that I've found to be tremendously useful. And I use it all the time whenever I'm designing anything. So thank you for watching. I hope you found this to be interesting. Please hit all of the buttons that you see below, the like button, the share button, the subscribe button, and see you next time.